The stars shined brightly in the night sky above Earth, a seemingly peaceful view that the people of the planet had grown accustomed to. On the surface, the world seemed calm, as if nothing could possibly disrupt the normal rhythm of life. But beyond the stars, a storm was quietly gathering, one that would change humanity's fate forever. It began on a warm summer evening. The satellites, the very lifeblood of modern communication, flickered for a moment, almost as if a glitch in the system had occurred. Then, without warning, they went dark. A sharp, sudden silence took over. The world was cut off from everything. No warning. No explanation. For a few moments, people on Earth assumed it was just a technical issue, something that could be fixed quickly. But then the sky itself began to change. Massive black shapes appeared on the horizon, far beyond the reach of any aircraft. They were too large to be natural. As panic began to spread, the first explosion hit the ground sharp, thunderous, and terrifying. It came from the sky, followed by a rain of fire. The cities below trembled as the ground shook beneath them. Across the globe, people scrambled in confusion, wondering if it was a natural disaster, a terrorist attack, or something far worse. But when the first reports came in, a terrible realization hit. It wasn't a natural event. It was something alien. The Varkari Dominion had arrived. A species that the human race had never encountered, never imagined. They came from a distant part of the galaxy, so far away that humanity's telescopes had only barely begun to detect their existence. At first, they thought the species would ignore Earth, viewing it as too insignificant. But the Varkari had different plans. The Varkari were not a peaceful species. They were conquerors, warriors forged in the fires of countless battles, each one more brutal than the last. The planet Earth, to them, was simply another resource, another world to claim as their own. They didn't need to communicate with Earth. They didn't care for diplomacy or treaties. Their intentions were clear from the moment they arrived: to conquer, to destroy, to take. In those early hours of the attack, most nations were caught off guard. There had been no warning, no signs that the Varkari were coming. Earth's global defense systems were unprepared. Military leaders, desperate to understand what was happening, scrambled to make sense of the overwhelming destruction. The first cities to be hit were leveled completely, their foundations reduced to rubble within minutes. The Varkari had technology far beyond what humanity could imagine. Their ships were enormous, their weapons powerful, and their attacks unrelenting. Each strike seemed timed to perfection, hitting critical infrastructure like military bases, communication hubs, and power plants. The world fell into chaos. Governments tried to mount defenses, but their attempts were futile. Each time they launched an attack, it was met with overwhelming force. The Varkari did not take prisoners. They did not make mistakes. They were a species born for war. In the heart of one of the devastated cities, a small group of survivors huddled together, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Among them was Sarah Montgomery, a young woman who had been in the city when the first explosion hit. She had seen the sky light up with fire, heard the screaming of thousands as they tried to escape. It was like something out of a nightmare. "Are we really under attack?" one of the survivors asked, his voice shaking. He looked up at the distant glow of the burning city around them, as if expecting the answer to come from the horizon. Sarah didn't have an answer. Her thoughts were clouded by the chaos, but one thing was clear to her: Earth was not ready. Humanity had never faced something like this before. As the hours passed, the attack continued, relentless and unstoppable. What shocked people the most wasn't the sheer power of the assault. It was the fact that the Varkari didn't seem to care about human life. In the eyes of the invaders, humans were no more than insects to be crushed beneath their boots. No offer of peace, no mercy. Just destruction. News outlets, in their desperate attempt to inform the public, broadcasted what little information they could gather. The Varkari ships loomed overhead, casting massive shadows over the cities, their weapons flashing as they struck without warning. They had no interest in negotiating. Their message was simple: surrender or perish. And then, the unthinkable happened. The attack on Earth, which had seemed to be a random assault at first, began to take a terrifying shape. It was clear now the Varkari were not just attacking at random. They were methodical. They were intelligent. They were choosing targets with precision, taking down power grids first, crippling military forces second, and slowly making their way through humanity's defense systems. Every move was calculated. The longer humanity resisted, the stronger the response from the Varkari. They didn't need to send armies. They had technology that did the job for them. As the day drew to a close, the survivors in the ruins of the city watched helplessly as the sky darkened once more, not from the setting sun, but from the shadow of something much worse. Something that had come from beyond the stars, something that wanted nothing less than total destruction. At the same time, in military command centers around the world, generals and leaders scrambled to understand what they were dealing with. In every language, in every corner of the globe, one thing was clear: Earth was under attack, and humanity was not prepared for what was coming next. But amid the chaos, there was one thing that the Varkari had not counted on: humans did not break easily. It was too early to tell, but a thought began to form in the minds of some survivors: this wouldn't be the end. Somewhere, deep within the heart of humanity, there was a spark. It might be small now, but it was growing, and one day it would be enough. After the first brutal wave of attacks, Earth was left in disarray, its cities in ruins and its people scattered, confused, and desperate. The invaders, the Varkari, had shown no mercy, no signs of weakness. They had come like a storm, sudden, unstoppable, and overwhelming. For a time, it seemed like humanity had no hope. But what the Varkari had failed to account for was something they had underestimated: humanity's resilience. In the days following the initial assault, the world had begun to change. Nations that had once been divided by borders, ideologies, and old grudges now found themselves in the strange position of having to unite. The surviving governments, despite their losses, sent out calls for cooperation. They knew they couldn't fight the Varkari alone. The global military forces, once fractured and isolated, began to form a unified command. This was no longer about individual countries. It was about humanity's survival. General Ava Renner stood at the front of one of the makeshift command centers that had sprung up in the weeks after the attack. Her face was tired, her eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, but her gaze was sharp, focused on the situation at hand. She had been there when the Varkari had struck. She had seen the destruction, the death, the helplessness of her fellow soldiers. But she had also seen something else, a flicker of something in the survivors. A spark that refused to die out, no matter how hard the invaders tried to crush it. "Ava, we can't hold the line much longer," said Captain Marco Rice, her second in command, his voice grave. His uniform was torn, stained with the dust and blood of the battlefield, and his eyes were filled with the same doubt that plagued them all. The war, it seemed, had already taken so much. He was right, time was running out. Earth was fighting a war. It couldn't win with conventional weapons, and every attempt to defend themselves had been met with greater force. The Varkari, with their overwhelming technology, had all but shattered humanity's defenses. But Ava wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. She had been a soldier long enough to know that the first attack wasn't always the last. She knew that the Varkari were brutal, but they weren't invincible. Every species had its weakness, its blind spots. The problem was finding those weaknesses before it was too late. The question was, could they? And if they could, would it be enough? In the weeks since the attack, humanity had scrambled to understand the enemy. What made the Varkari so deadly? How had they managed to conquer so many worlds before coming to Earth? Scientists, engineers, and military leaders worked around the clock, studying the wreckage of the alien ships, trying to reverse engineer their technology. Some of it made no sense to them. Some of it was too advanced. But there were breakthroughs. Small ones at first. Pieces of the puzzle that, when put together, might provide the key to survival. One of those breakthroughs came from an unlikely place. Dr. Lucas Faraday, a quiet scientist with a passion for deep space engineering, had been studying the wreckage of a downed Varkari ship when he noticed something odd, a pattern in the energy signatures of their weapons. It was subtle, but it was there. The Varkari were powerful, yes, but their weapons had a flaw. They couldn't sustain their full power for long periods. The energy needed to launch their devastating strikes drained their ships more quickly than expected. It was a weakness, one that had been overlooked in the rush to defend against them. When Ava heard the news, her mind began to race. If they could exploit this weakness, they might have a fighting chance. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next few days were a blur of strategy meetings and frantic planning. They couldn't afford to waste any time. Humanity had been pushed to the edge, and now it was time to push back. But the Varkari weren't sitting idly by either. As humanity started to regroup, the invaders launched their own offensive. They weren't content to simply bombard Earth from afar. No, the Varkari were coming down to the surface. They were landing. Their war machines, giant armored beasts that could crush entire buildings with a single stomp, appeared in the skies, descending upon Earth's remaining cities like a plague. The destruction was worse than before, faster, more efficient. Cities that had once stood proud now lay in ruins, and the people who had survived the initial attacks now faced their worst nightmare: invasion on the ground. Ava's forces were ready, though. They had something the Varkari hadn't anticipated. Humans had an ability to adapt that no alien species could match. The old methods weren't working, but the new ones were beginning to bear fruit. With the help of the stolen alien technology, they had created weapons that could match the Varkari's power, if only for short bursts. They had also figured out a way to disrupt the Varkari's communications, confusing their forces and causing chaos in their ranks. It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy time. In the thick of the battle, Ava led her soldiers into the fray. Her mind was focused on one thing: surviving long enough to hit the Varkari where it hurt. Her team had a target: an advanced Varkari warship. If they could take it down, they might be able to cripple the Varkari's operations, or at least slow them down. The mission was dangerous, and Ava knew the odds were slim. But it was the only chance they had. As her squad navigated through the burning streets of the city, the air was thick with smoke and the sound of explosions. The Varkari war machines towered above them, moving with terrifying precision. There was no time to waste. The clock was ticking. Ava's heart pounded in her chest as they reached the base of the warship. It loomed above them, its guns aimed downward, ready to fire. They had to get inside. They had to find the core and disable it. The plan was simple but deadly. As they fought their way through the last line of defense, Ava couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. If they failed, it would be the end. The Varkari would take Earth, and humanity would be lost. But as they breached the inner walls of the warship, a strange feeling washed over Ava. It was a sense of purpose, a realization that this was their last chance. They might not win, but they could show the Varkari what humans were capable of. They could prove that attacking Earth was the greatest mistake they would ever make. The explosion rocked the warship, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The skies darkened as the sound of the blast echoed across the city. And as the Varkari forces scrambled to regroup, one thing became clear: the storm had only just begun. Weeks had passed since humanity's desperate strike against the Varkari warship. The battle was far from over, but something had shifted. The war was no longer just about survival. It was about retaliation. The small victories, though few, had begun to fuel the fire within humanity's heart. Earth's armies were no longer running from the Varkari. They were standing tall, ready to push back. The Varkari, for the first time since the war began, had been made to feel the sting of defeat. General Ava Renner stood before a massive holographic map of the galaxy, her fingers tracing the locations of the Varkari forces. Each one of their ships, every blockade, every forward base, they were all marked in red. But now, humanity had more than just the will to survive. They had the tools. They had the knowledge. They had the strength. "We're hitting them hard, but this is just the beginning," Ava said, her voice cutting through the silence of the command room. "We need to make them feel what we felt. We need to make them regret ever stepping foot on our planet." Around her, the room hummed with activity. Officers worked at consoles, their faces tense as they coordinated new strategies. The latest intelligence had given humanity an edge they'd fought hard for. The Varkari had underestimated human ingenuity. They thought that after a few brutal strikes, Earth would surrender. But they were wrong. They had pushed humanity to the brink, and now humanity was striking back. The first step in the counterattack was simple: disrupt. The Varkari were powerful, but their dependence on technology left them vulnerable. In the early days of the war, the Varkari had ignored the possibility that humans might adapt quickly enough to counter their advanced weapons. The stolen alien tech had given Earth scientists and engineers a huge advantage. It wasn't just about having weapons. It was about finding ways to use them in ways the Varkari couldn't predict. The humans had developed a weapon of their own, a powerful EMP blast capable of disabling the Varkari's advanced shield systems. The weapon was still in its early stages, but it was enough to give the humans a fighting chance. Ava had planned the first strike carefully. They would hit a critical Varkari supply hub on the outskirts of the system, disrupt their communication and supply lines, and cripple their forces. It was a risky mission, but Ava wasn't one to shy away from risks. Not now. ASS the strike force prepared to launch. Ava stood alone in a darkened hallway, staring out at the night sky. The stars twinkled in the distance, peaceful and silent. But Earth had no peace. There was only the fight against the Varkari, against the forces that sought to wipe humanity off the map. She clenched her fists, feeling the weight of the coming battle. It was time to take the fight to the enemy. In the command room, the countdown began. Ava could hear it echoing through her mind, the seconds ticking away, drawing them closer to the moment that could change everything. 15 seconds, came the calm voice of her chief strategist. Ava took one last deep breath, her eyes narrowing in focus. She wasn't going to let Earth fall. Not while she was still standing. Launch. Thousands of ships, from small fighters to massive assault vessels, surged forward toward the Varkari's stronghold. Ava's ship, the Resolute, was at the forefront of the charge, its engines glowing with intensity as it pushed toward the enemy lines. On board, the crew worked with relentless precision, each movement a testament to how far they had come. The unity that had once seemed impossible was now their greatest strength. The battle was fierce, chaotic. The Varkari had expected a weaker, more disorganized response, but they had underestimated humanity's resolve. Their ships, though powerful, struggled to defend against the swarm of human vessels. The Varkari shield systems faltered, flickering under the strain of the EMP blasts, allowing Earth's fighters to engage. For the first time in the war, the Varkari were on the defensive. But the Varkari were no fools. As soon as the tide shifted, they adapted. Their reinforcements arrived in droves, larger and more powerful ships that glowed with deadly energy. The battle intensified, the blackness of space illuminated by the flashes of laser fire and explosions. Human fighters darted in and out, avoiding the Varkari's deadly blasts, using the terrain to their advantage. It was a dance of destruction, but every strike, every maneuver, brought the humans one step closer to victory. In the midst of the chaos, Ava's ship cut through the heart of the battle. She could feel the vibrations of the massive weapons as they tore through the Varkari's defenses. Her crew worked with an unspoken rhythm, responding to her every command as if they were one mind. Ava knew that this mission would determine the course of the war. If they could disable the Varkari's command ship, if they could cripple their leadership, it would be a blow they couldn't recover from. Then, through the chaos, she saw it. The Varkari command ship, its enormous form looming in the distance. It was heavily guarded, surrounded by dozens of Varkari warships. Ava's heart raced. This was the target. This was the moment. Lock onto their command center, Ava ordered, her voice steady. Prepare to fire everything we've got. The crew responded instantly, their hands flying over their controls. Ava's eyes never left the command ship as her own ship closed in. The Varkari were focused on repelling the smaller fighters, unaware of the impending threat from the Resolute. In a final, desperate attempt to defend their leader, the Varkari fired everything they had. But Ava had already anticipated their move. She steered the Resolute sharply, dodging the incoming fire with expert precision. "Target locked," came the calm voice from the weapons officer. Ava's breath caught in her throat. This was it. They only had one shot. "Fire," she commanded. The blast was instantaneous, a brilliant flash of light that tore through the void of space, slamming into the Varkari command ship. For a moment, everything went silent. The impact was so powerful that the Varkari ship seemed to shudder, its shields collapsing under the force. Sparks erupted from its hull as it began to break apart. It was a blow the Varkari hadn't expected, and in the silence that followed, it became clear humanity had struck back, and the Varkari were reeling. But the battle was far from over. Ava knew that this was only the first blow. The Varkari would regroup, and they would come at Earth with everything they had. But for the first time, the humans were no longer the prey. They were the hunters. As the Resolute pulled away from the explosion, Ava looked out the viewport. The stars had never seemed so bright, and in that moment, she knew that no matter how many battles were ahead, humanity was no longer the underdog. They had struck the first real blow in this war. And now, the Varkari would feel what it was like to be on the losing side. The counterpunch had been landed. The storm had turned in humanity's favor. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in months, the tide had shifted. Humanity's counterattack had shaken the Varkari, but their response was swift and brutal. As the dust settled, both sides knew that the war was entering a new phase. What had started as a calculated invasion by the Varkari had turned into a deadly, unpredictable conflict. But while the humans were filled with determination, the Varkari were filled with rage. They had underestimated Earth's ability to fight back, and now they would make humanity pay. It started slowly at first, small signs, whispers in the dark. Military officials, survivors, and refugees alike began to hear the same stories. The Varkari were not just targeting cities, they were targeting hope. They were hunting down any sign of resistance, erasing it with cruel efficiency. Where once there had been life, there was only destruction. And with every city they wiped off the map, fear began to spread like wildfire. In the quiet streets of a small town, one of the last remaining strongholds, Sarah Montgomery stood outside, staring at the sky. The atmosphere felt different, heavier, darker. She could feel it in her bones. The Varkari were getting desperate. They had taken everything from Earth, but they still wanted more. They wanted to break humanity's spirit. And to do that, they would destroy the very thing that made humanity dangerous, its hope. The whispers had started to turn into real threats. There were reports coming in from all over the world, refugees fleeing the chaos, survivors abandoning the front lines, cities falling without a single shot being fired. The Varkari weren't just conquering, they were terrorizing. They would strike fast, they would strike hard, and they would leave no trace. People began to fear that no place was safe, that no city, no village, no person was out of reach. Sarah's heart ached as she looked at the horizon. The world she had known, the world she had fought to protect, was slipping away. It was as if the very air itself was infected with fear. People were no longer fighting back, they were running. And as each new report came in, the truth became more undeniable. The Varkari weren't just killing people. They were making them afraid to fight at all. In a war room far from Sarah's position, General Ava Renner paced, her mind racing. The Varkari had upped the stakes, launching a series of targeted strikes at resistance groups and survivors' camps. Every attempt to mount a counteroffensive was met with swift retribution. The human forces were losing ground, and Ava knew that fear was spreading faster than they could contain it. It was the Varkari's most dangerous weapon, terror. They knew that if they could break humanity's will, victory would be assured. And so, they attacked not just with weapons, but with fear itself. Ava's eyes scanned the situation reports, each one darker than the last. Entire regions had fallen silent. Communication had been cut off. It was as if whole parts of Earth had simply vanished. And yet, there were still pockets of resistance, still places where humanity refused to give up. But how long could they hold out against an enemy that used fear as a weapon? As she studied the map, Ava's mind raced through strategies, possibilities, counterattacks. She couldn't let fear take root, not now, not when they had finally begun to strike back. She slammed her fist on the table, making the officers around her jump. We cannot let them win this battle of terror. If we let them break our spirit, it's over. But even as she spoke, she knew how difficult it would be. The Varkari had a way of making fear feel real, making it consume everything. It wasn't just in the air, it was in the hearts of people. Every story of a city falling, every message from a survivor filled with terror, weakened humanity's resolve. The question wasn't just how to defeat the Varkari's army, it was how to defeat the fear they had spread so far. In the midst of the chaos, Sarah's small group of survivors had taken refuge in a hidden underground bunker. The world above them was a war zone, but down here, it was almost peaceful, too peaceful. The silence was unnerving. Sarah sat in a corner, her eyes fixed on the dim lights that flickered above her. The air was thick with tension, the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. She heard footsteps approaching, soft but quick. She looked up to see one of the younger survivors, a boy named Ethan, walking toward her. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. Sarah, I heard something. I don't know if it's the Varkari, but there's movement outside. We need to leave. Now. Her heart skipped a beat. Fear had already spread here, too. Ethan's voice cracked as he spoke, but his fear wasn't the same as the terror that gripped the world. This was a different kind of fear, a fear born of uncertainty. Were they already too late to escape? Should they even try to fight back? Sarah stood up, shaking off her doubts. We'll go check it out, she said, trying to sound confident. But inside, she wasn't so sure. She had seen firsthand how quickly fear could take hold of a person, a group, an entire population. The Varkari knew it too. And now it seemed that even their smallest movements sent waves of panic spreading. Together, they moved cautiously toward the exit, their steps soft against the cold concrete floor. The outside world was a foreign place now, a place of danger and death. The once bustling streets were empty, silent, as if the world had simply stopped turning. As they reached the surface, Sarah's eyes scanned the sky. The same dark clouds that had hung over the earth for weeks now seemed even darker. The Varkari had brought their terror with them, like a cloud of death hovering over everything. Suddenly, a loud crash shattered the silence. Sarah spun around, her heart racing. She could see the distant silhouette of a Varkari warship descending rapidly toward the city. Fear gripped her chest like an iron vice. The Varkari were here, and they had found them. Get back inside, Sarah yelled, her voice sharp with urgency. The others rushed back toward the bunker, their fear now a tangible thing that they could no longer ignore. But as they ran, Sarah felt the ground shake beneath her feet, and a terrible realization hit her. The Varkari weren't just attacking, they were hunting down every last bit of resistance, hunting down the hope that still flickered in the hearts of those who refused to surrender. In the command room, Ava's voice was a steady force, rallying her troops. We can't give in to fear. They want us to fall apart. We won't let them. Fight back, fight for every inch, and we will win. But even as Ava spoke, the weight of the world pressed on her shoulders. The Varkari had succeeded in spreading fear, and fear was a fire. It spread quickly, consumed everything in its path. And in that fire, humanity's courage was being tested. Would they rise, or would they burn? The day of reckoning had arrived, and for humanity, it was more than just a battle, it was the final stand. For months, the Varkari had pushed Earth to the edge, their attacks brutal and relentless. Every victory had come with a price, but humanity had paid it without hesitation. They had no choice. The world they knew was on the brink of destruction, and they could either fall into darkness or fight back with everything they had left. General Ava Renner stood in the command center, watching the holoscreen in front of her. The map of the world was a patchwork of red and green. Red marked the Varkari forces, spreading farther and farther each day, while green marked the remnants of humanity's last defenses. It was a desperate situation. The Varkari had all but wiped out the major cities, leaving only pockets of resistance scattered across the globe. But they hadn't crushed humanity's spirit. and now it was time to make them regret that. Ava's mind raced as she stared at the screen. There was no more room for mistakes. The counterattacks, the tactical retreats, they had been a test. Now, everything hinged on the final strike, the one move that could either destroy the Varkari once and for all, or seal humanity's fate. She knew the odds. The Varkari were strong. Their ships were formidable. Their tactics were nearly flawless. But humanity had one thing they didn't: the will to survive. The plan had been in motion for days, and now it was all coming together. Earth's forces were assembling, slowly but surely, at key locations. Fighters, warships, and support crafts were positioned like pieces on a chessboard. But this wasn't just a fight for victory, it was a fight for survival. If they lost this battle, Earth would be lost. The Varkari would rule, and humanity would be erased from the stars. As Ava walked through the war room, her eyes met those of the men and women around her. Some were young, their faces filled with fear and uncertainty. Others were older, hardened by months of constant conflict. But all of them shared the same determination. They weren't just fighting for Earth anymore, they were fighting for each other, for the hope that still burned within them. It was that hope that had kept them going through every loss, every defeat. It was that hope that had made them the deadliest species in the galaxy. "We're ready," her strategist, Commander Liam Hayes, said, his voice steady despite the tension that filled the room. "The fleet is in position. We can launch at any moment." Ava nodded, her heart pounding. She looked out the window, where the sky was dark with the shadow of the Varkari ships overhead. The final battle was about to begin. The clock ticked down. Every second brought them closer to either victory or annihilation. Ava felt the weight of her role more than ever. She wasn't just leading soldiers into battle, she was leading the last hope of an entire planet. The pressure was unbearable, but she had no choice but to push forward. In the heart of the Varkari fleet, their command ship loomed large. It was massive, an entire city of alien technology designed to be impenetrable. Inside its cold, metallic walls, the Varkari generals prepared for the final assault on Earth. They were confident. The humans had fought well, yes, but their resistance was crumbling. The Varkari had crushed most of the world's major defenses. Only a few ragged pockets remained, but they were no threat. Soon, the Varkari would be the masters of Earth, and the galaxy would be theirs. But they had underestimated humanity, as they always had. The humans had nothing left to lose, and that made them dangerous. As the fleets prepared for the final showdown, Sarah Montgomery stood in a small bunker on the outskirts of the city. She had fought alongside Ava in some of the earlier strikes, but now she was just one of the survivors. Her heart ached as she looked out at the sky, knowing what was coming. She had heard the reports the Varkari were preparing for their final push. But there was something different in the air today, something she couldn't quite place. She had heard the stories. The ones about humanity's resilience, how they had fought back against impossible odds. But she wasn't sure if that was enough anymore. The Varkari had the upper hand. They had the technology. They had the firepower. The humans had hope, and hope didn't always win wars. But Sarah couldn't give in to that fear. Not now. Not when everything was at stake. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for her family, for every life lost in the conflict. She had seen cities fall, people die, but she had also seen something else, the spark of defiance that refused to die, no matter how much the Varkari pushed. The final countdown began. Ava's voice echoed in the comms, her words calm but filled with a fierce determination. "All ships, engage the enemy. This is it. For Earth." The battle exploded into chaos. The first wave of human fighters streaked across the sky, their engines roaring as they darted in and out of the massive Varkari fleet. Explosions lit up the darkened expanse of space, the shockwaves sending ripples through the void. The Varkari responded with overwhelming force, unleashing everything they had. The humans fought with everything they had left: laser blasts, MPs, missiles, and sheer willpower. Ava's ship, the Resolute, led the charge. The ship was built for this moment, designed to take the full brunt of the Varkari's most devastating attacks and still keep fighting. Ava gripped the controls, her eyes fixed on the massive command ship at the heart of the Varkari fleet. It was the key to victory. If they could destroy it, the Varkari would lose their ability to coordinate the attack, and the remaining forces would be disorganized, vulnerable. But the command ship was heavily guarded, its defenses nearly impenetrable. Ava pushed forward, leading her fleet in a daring assault. They cut through the Varkari ships like a blade through paper, the humans' smaller, faster ships taking advantage of every gap, every weakness in the enemy's defenses. But the Varkari weren't easy prey. Their ships were as ruthless as they were advanced, and they fought back with a ferocity that only made the humans fight harder. Inside the Varkari command ship, the generals were beginning to realize they had underestimated their opponents. The tide of battle was shifting, but it was too late to stop it. Ava's fleet was closing in on them, and they couldn't stop it. The Varkari were about to learn the hard truth. When you push humanity to the edge, when you force them to fight for their survival, they will become something you never expected. They will become a force of nature. They will become the reckoning. A final shot rang out. The massive Varkari ship exploded in a burst of light, its core obliterated. The Varkari fleet scattered, its leadership gone. The remaining ships, without direction, began to fall apart. On the ground, Sarah stood in stunned silence as she watched the sky. It wasn't over yet, but the tide had turned. For the first time in months, hope burned bright once again. The reckoning had come and humanity had won.